Before the hook, one sharp truth. A 6-year-old girl stood in the middle of the schoolyard, her dress still dusty from the long road west, her shoes 2 sizes too small, and the man who had just arrived in town pointed at her and laughed. Not a chuckle. A full, ugly, open-mouthed laugh. No daddy? Ha! Even the stray dogs in this town got a better pedigree than that child. He said it loud enough for the whole street to hear, loud enough for Lucy Hart to go completely still, the way a small animal goes still right before it understands what danger is. Her mother, Evelyn, standing 6 feet away with 2 suitcases and no allies, felt every word land like a slap. She opened her mouth. Nothing came. But from across the street, a man nobody expected to moved. If you've ever watched someone mock a child and felt your blood turn to fire, stay with me. This story is going to reach somewhere deep. Subscribe to this channel right now so you never miss what comes next. And if this story moves you, hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to where it all began. The wagon that carried Evelyn Hart and her daughter into Millhaven, Wyoming on a gray October morning was not the kind of wagon that announced itself. No bright paint, no provisions stacked high, just 2 battered trunks, a crate of school books wrapped in oilcloth, and a woman sitting bored straight with her jaw set in a way that said she had already cried everything she had to cry, and she was not going to start again. Lucy sat beside her, 6 years old, her dark hair in 2 braids that Evelyn had redone 3 times that morning because her hands needed something to do. The little girl had her face turned toward the town as it came into view. The general store, the livery, the church with its crooked steeple, the mud-packed main street with its deep wagon ruts, and she was quiet in the way that children go quiet when they can sense their mother's fear without being told a word about it. Evelyn had taken this job because there was no other job. The letter from the Millhaven School Board had arrived 6 weeks after the funeral, forwarded twice, finally reaching her at her sister's house in Ohio, where she had been sleeping on a cot in the sewing room and trying very hard not to become a burden. The letter offered $40 a month, a cabin behind the schoolhouse, and the title of schoolmistress. It had not mentioned that Millhaven was 3 days from the nearest railway station, that the last teacher had left after one winter, or that the town ran itself the way frontier towns tended to run, which was to say, with little patience for anything or anyone that didn't fit the established order. She had taken it anyway, because Lucy needed food and a roof, because pride was a luxury Evelyn Hart had buried alongside her husband Thomas on a cold February morning 7 months ago, because sometimes a woman takes the only door that's open, not because it leads somewhere good, but because all the other doors are locked. The wagon driver, a lean man named Cobb, who had barely spoken in 3 days, pulled up in front of the general store and jerked his thumb toward the far end of the street. Schoolhouse is down that way, cabin's behind it. Key's supposed to be with whoever runs this place. He said it without looking at her. He was already calculating his return trip. Evelyn stepped down from the wagon. Her legs were stiff. She helped Lucy down after her, and Lucy landed in the mud with a small, resigned splash and looked down at her boots with an expression that, on a 6-year-old, was almost philosophical. "It's okay," Lucy said. Not to her mother. Just to the mud, probably. Evelyn pulled both trunks down herself. Cobb didn't offer. She hadn't expected him to. The street wasn't busy, but it wasn't empty either. A woman in a blue apron was sweeping the general store steps and had stopped sweeping the moment the wagon arrived. 2 men outside the barber shop were watching with the particular stillness of people who have decided to observe without committing to anything. A boy of about 10 ran past on some errand, glanced at Lucy, and kept running. Evelyn straightened her coat, picked up the smaller of the 2 trunks, and was reaching for the larger one when she heard the voice. It came from a man leaning against the post outside the saloon across the street. He was heavy-set, maybe 45, wearing a sheepskin coat that was too fine for a town like this, which meant he was either a rancher with money or he wanted people to think he was. He had a face that had spent years perfecting the expression of someone who is about to say something he already finds funny. "Well, look at that." He said it to the man beside him, but loud, deliberately loud. "The new schoolteacher, with her little..." He paused, made a show of looking around, exaggerating the gesture. Where's the husband? I don't see a husband. The man beside him snorted. Evelyn did not look at him. She gripped the trunk handle. No daddy, huh? The man stepped off the post and raised his voice further, dropping all pretense of talking to his companion. He was talking to the street now. He was performing. Even the stray dogs in this town got a better pedigree than that child. The laugh came out of him like something that had been waiting all morning for a reason to exist. Lucy went still. It was the stillness that broke Evelyn. Not the words, not the laugh, but that stillness in her daughter's body, the way Lucy's small shoulders came up around her ears like she was trying to become smaller, like she was calculating, at 6 years old, whether she could disappear. Evelyn turned. She had a full response ready, a teacher's response, a widow's response, a mother's response, all three at once, which meant what came out instead was a short, sharp silence while she tried to decide which one was worth wasting on a man like that. She never got to decide, because from the far side of the street, someone else moved first. She almost didn't notice him at first. He had been standing at the edge of the hardware store porch, a tall man, lean in the way that comes from work rather than intention, wearing a coat that was practical and nothing more. He had been watching the scene unfold, not with the passive stillness of the other observers, but with something different, something that had been tightening slowly, the way a rope tightens when weight is added to it. He crossed the street without hurrying. That was the first thing Evelyn noticed about him. He did not rush. He moved like a man who had decided something and did not see any reason to be dramatic about it. He stopped in front of the man in the sheepskin coat. He was not taller. He did not raise his voice. He said, simply and with a flatness that somehow carried further than a shout, "Say it again." The man blinked. The performance faltered. "I beg your—" "You heard me, Roy." Still flat, still quiet. "Say it again. Let's find out how funny it is the second time." Roy's mouth moved. Something was clearly working itself out behind his eyes. The calculation of a man who is used to being the loudest person in a space, trying to recalibrate in real time. He glanced at his companion. His companion had found something interesting to look at on the ground. "I was just making an observation," Roy said, in the voice of a man climbing down from a tree and pretending he had intended to come down all along. "No offense meant." "Go inside, Roy." A beat. 2 beats. Roy went inside. The man turned. He looked at Lucy first. Not at Evelyn, at Lucy. He crouched down, which on a man his height took a moment, until he was at the eye level of a 6-year-old. He looked at her directly, without the cautious, slightly embarrassed look that most adults gave children in uncomfortable situations. "You okay?" he asked. Lucy stared at him. She was still doing the internal calculation. Friend, stranger, threat, unknown quantity. Her dark eyes were serious in the way that children's eyes get serious when they've been required to understand things they should have had another 10 years before encountering. "My shoes have mud on them," she said. "Mine too," he said. He held up one boot. It was in fact muddy. Happens every October. Something shifted in Lucy's face. Not a smile. Something smaller than a smile, but more durable. The man stood. He looked at Evelyn. He had gray eyes, the kind that looked different in different light. Just then, in the flat October overcast, they looked tired. "Silas Boone," he said. He did not offer his hand immediately. He waited, a small thing, but it registered. "Evelyn Hart." She offered her hand first because she had been raised to and because she was too tired to worry about what that communicated to onlookers. He shook it, firm, brief, appropriate. "You're the new teacher." "I am." He looked at the 2 trunks on the ground, then at the crate of books still on the wagon, then at the wagon pulling away because Cobb had apparently decided his professional obligations had concluded. He did not say anything about any of it. He simply picked up the larger trunk. "Cabin's this way," he said. She almost told him not to. The refusal was right there. She could feel it, the instinct to say, "I can manage, thank you," the reflex that had kept her standing upright for 7 months by insisting that she did not need anything from anyone. But the trunk was heavy, and her arms were tired, and Lucy was pulling at her coat sleeve and looking at the man with the muddy boots with something very close to interest. "Thank you," Evelyn said, and picked up the smaller trunk and followed. The cabin was exactly what she had expected, which was to say it was structurally sound and aggressively unwelcoming. One room, a wood stove with a broken flue damper, two narrow windows, a sleeping loft that Lucy would need a ladder to reach, a floor that was clean but cold, and a smell that suggested the previous occupant had kept chickens indoors at some point. The key, as promised, had been left with the general store owner, a woman named Mrs. Prentice, who had handed it over with the expression of someone discharging a civic duty they personally found questionable. Silas set the trunk down inside the door and looked at the stove without being asked to. He opened the flue, examined the damper, made a sound that was not quite a word, and looked at the rusted hinge that was causing the problem. "I can fix that," he said. "You don't have to," Evelyn said. "No," he agreed. He looked at her. "I don't have to." He fixed it anyway. He had a small knife on his belt and he worked the hinge with it for 4 minutes while Lucy sat on one of the trunks and watched him with the focused attention she usually reserved for things she was trying to understand. Evelyn stood in the middle of the room and felt simultaneously grateful and unsettled and profoundly tired. "There's a woodpile behind the schoolhouse," he said when he was done with the flue. "It's low. I'll bring more before the week's out." "Mr. Boone." "Silas." "Silas." She stopped. The thing she had been meaning to say, that she didn't want charity, that she intended to pay her way, that she was not the kind of woman who needed to be rescued, seemed to get stuck somewhere between her chest and her mouth. "Why?" she finally said. Just that one word. He considered this for a moment, like it was a genuine question deserving a genuine answer. "Roy Callahan has been the loudest man in this town for 15 years, he said. "Somebody should have shut him up a long time ago." He paused. "The woodpile is just woodpile. Winter comes fast out here." He was at the door when Lucy spoke. "Mister?" She was still sitting on the trunk. Her braids had come slightly undone on one side. "Do you have a little girl?" Silas stopped. Something moved through his face, a change in weather, there and gone. "No," he said, "I don't." Lucy absorbed this. "Did you used to?" "Lucy," Evelyn said quietly. But Silas didn't look offended. He looked at Lucy for a long moment with those gray eyes that were doing something complicated. "Yeah," he said. "I used to." He left before Lucy could ask the next question, which she was clearly preparing, and Evelyn stood in the doorway and watched him walk back up the street toward wherever he had come from, his coat against the gray October light, and she felt something she hadn't felt in 7 months and couldn't name and wasn't ready to examine. Inside, Lucy had gotten off the trunk and was standing at the small window, watching him go. "Mama," she said. "What, baby?" "He was sad." Evelyn looked at her daughter, 6 years old. "Why do you say that?" "Because of how he looked when I asked." Lucy turned from the window. "It's the same how you look when somebody asks about Daddy." Evelyn stood there in the middle of the cold one-room cabin with her 2 battered trunks and her crate of books and her $40 a month job at the end of the world, and she did not cry. She had promised herself she was done crying, but something in her chest did something she couldn't fully control, and she crossed the room and pulled Lucy into her arms and held her there, with the broken-down frontier town outside the window and the smell of old wood and somebody's former chickens, and she held on. "When does school start?" Lucy asked, muffled against her mother's coat. "Monday," Evelyn said. "That's 3 days." "Yes." "Can we get a broom? The floor is dirty." Evelyn laughed. It surprised her. The laugh. It came out a little ragged around the edges, slightly too close to something else, but it was a laugh. "Yes," she said. "We can get a broom." That night, with the fire going and Lucy asleep in the loft, Evelyn sat at the small table with Thomas's photograph in front of her and let herself feel everything she'd been driving ahead of all day. The fear, the loneliness, the specific humiliation of having your child mocked in public in a strange town and being too slow to defend her. The shame of being grateful to a stranger for doing what she should have done herself. And underneath all of it, something she would not have admitted to anyone, a strange and unwanted flicker of something that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with a tall man in a muddy coat who had crouched down to be eye level with her daughter. She turned the photograph face down on the table, then felt guilty and turned it back up. "I'm all right," she told Thomas quietly. It was something she'd been saying since February. Most days it was half true. Outside, the wind picked up and pushed at the cabin walls. The flue worked perfectly. The stove threw good heat. She sat with it all until the candle burned low. Monday came. Evelyn had spent the 3 days scrubbing the schoolhouse floor, organizing the 4 donated textbooks and 7 readers into some kind of workable curriculum for 17 children of varying ages, and doing a careful, thorough, deliberately exhausting job of not thinking about Silas Boone. She was mostly successful. The woodpile was restocked before Saturday morning. She had not heard him do it. She'd gone out at first light, and it was simply there. 2 cords split clean and stacked with a neatness that said something about who'd done it without any note or announcement attached. School started at 8. 11 children came. 3 were kept home by parents who, she would learn later, were waiting to see whether the new teacher was worth the journey. 2 were sick. 1, a 10-year-old boy named Danny Greaves, came in 40 minutes late and sat at the back with the posture of someone who had been told too many times that he was a lost cause. Lucy was there, sitting in the front row, the only student whose age Evelyn had been certain of in advance. The first hour was fine. Evelyn had always been a good teacher. It was one of the few things she knew about herself without any ambivalence, and she fell into the work with the relief of someone picking up a tool they understand. The children were attentive in the wary way of children who haven't yet decided what to make of something new. Danny Greaves in the back was at least looking in the right direction. The trouble started at recess. Evelyn was inside organizing the noon lesson when she heard it, a particular quality of silence from the schoolyard that she had learned to recognize, the silence of children watching something happen. She was out the door in 4 seconds. Lucy was standing in the center of the yard. 4 children were around her, including 2 of the bigger boys. Not touching her, not quite, but arranged in the configuration of children who are about to make a decision about whether they're going to be cruel or just testing. The tallest boy, she'd learned his name was Marcus Callahan, and yes, Roy's son, was saying something that Evelyn caught the tail end of as she crossed the yard. "No daddy means nobody wanted you. Everybody knows that." Lucy's face was doing the thing again, the stillness, the becoming smaller. But her chin was up, which was Thomas in her, absolutely and unmistakably Thomas, and Evelyn felt the recognition like a hand around her heart. She walked into the center of that circle. She did not raise her voice. She stood between Lucy and Marcus Callahan, and she looked at the boy for a long enough moment that he began to understand what kind of teacher had arrived in Millhaven. "Go inside," she said. He went. She waited until the yard was clear before she looked down at Lucy. Lucy was still doing the chin-up thing. Her eyes were bright in a way that was not quite tears, but was the structure that holds tears back. "Mama," she said. "I know," Evelyn said. "Am I nobody wanted?" The hand around Evelyn's heart squeezed. "No," she said. "You are the most specifically wanted person I know." "Because you want me." "Yes." "But Daddy's gone." "Daddy always wanted you. He didn't want to go." Lucy considered this. It was the same conversation they'd had in versions, many times, and each time Lucy came at it from a slightly different angle, like a problem she was still working out. "Marcus has a daddy," she said. "Marcus does." "Is Marcus luckier than me?" Evelyn was quiet for a second too long. "You have me," she said, "and right now that is going to have to be enough." Lucy nodded slowly. It wasn't satisfaction. It was more like she was filing the answer away under things that are true, but not complete. Then she straightened her back and looked at the schoolhouse door. "Can we go back in now?" she said. "I want to finish the reading." Evelyn watched her daughter walk back through the schoolhouse door, 7 months old in grief, and already navigating it with a practicality that was both a relief and a kind of breaking Evelyn would never fully get over. She was still standing there when she realized someone was at the fence. Silas Boone. He had a coil of wire over one shoulder. He'd apparently been doing something with the fence post on the far corner. and he had clearly seen at least part of what had just happened in the schoolyard. He wasn't pretending he hadn't. He just looked at her across the fence with those gray eyes and didn't say anything at all, which was somehow worse than if he had. Evelyn nodded at him, once, the way you nod at someone when you don't trust your voice. He nodded back. He went back to the fence post, but he stayed until the school day ended. Evelyn told herself she hadn't noticed. She was a school teacher. She had 17 students, at least 4 of whom needed significant individual attention, and a curriculum to build from almost nothing, and a daughter to raise on the outer edge of the civilized world. She had no time to notice anything. She noticed everything. He stayed until the school day ended. That was the part Evelyn kept coming back to later, when she was trying to understand how things had begun to shift without her permission. Not that he had intervened on the first day. That could have been impulse, or irritation at Roy, or any number of reasons that had nothing to do with her specifically. Not that he had restocked the woodpile without announcing it, though that had meant something too. But that on a Tuesday afternoon with wire to string and fence posts to set, Silas Boone had positioned himself within eyeline of a schoolyard and stayed there until 17 children had gone home and one small girl in muddy boots had walked back to the cabin behind the schoolhouse holding her mother's hand. He hadn't waved. He hadn't called out. He had simply been present in the way that certain people are present, not obtrusively, not with any demand that you acknowledge them, just there, like a fence post that had been there long enough to feel like it belonged. Evelyn told herself this meant nothing. She was good at telling herself things. The second week of school brought 2 more students, the Aldrich twins, a boy and a girl, 9 years old, sent by a father who had apparently decided the new teacher was worth the 2-mile walk after all. It also brought the first real snow, a thin preliminary dusting that was gone by noon but that carried in its disappearance the clear message that it was only scouting, that more was behind it and meant business. It brought something else too. On Wednesday morning, Evelyn arrived at the schoolhouse to find that the broken window latch on the east side, the one she'd been meaning to report to whoever one reported such things to in Mill Haven, had been fixed. New wood, new hardware, the frame squared and sealed with something that smelled like pine tar and would hold against weather. There was no note. There didn't need to be. She stood in the empty schoolroom for a moment, looking at the window, and felt something she actively resented feeling, which was the specific vulnerability of being cared for when you've spent 7 months building your life around the belief that you don't need to be. She asked Mrs. Prentice at the general store that afternoon if the school board had sent someone. Mrs. Prentice looked at her over the counter with the particular expression of a woman who knows exactly what's happening and has decided to let the other person figure it out themselves. "Not that I know of," she said, and turned to reorganize a shelf of thread that hadn't needed reorganizing. Evelyn let it go. She had 17 students and a crumbling curriculum and a daughter who had started waking up in the night again, the way she had in the weeks after Thomas died. Not crying, just awake, sitting up in the loft with her knees to her chest and her eyes open in the dark. "I'm right here," Evelyn would say from the bed below. "I know," Lucy would say, and lie back down, and sometimes sleep and sometimes not. Evelyn understood it. Grief didn't travel in a straight line, it circled back. It visited in the night when the defenses were down and the work of the day was finished, and there was nothing left to do but feel it. She knew because she did the same thing herself, just more quietly. Friday of the second week, Silas Boone came to the schoolhouse door at 4 o'clock, after the children had gone, with a question about the stovepipe, specifically whether it had been drawing correctly, because he'd noticed from the road that the smoke angle suggested a partial blockage, which, he explained in the matter-of-fact way of a man who has spent decades reading the practical world, would become a genuine problem once the real cold set in. Evelyn opened the door and looked at him for a moment before she answered. "You've been watching my stovepipe from the road," she said. "I drive past most mornings," he said. "It's on the way to the feed store." "Millhaven has one road." "It does," he agreed, without any indication that this proved anything he didn't already know. She let him look at the stovepipe. He was right. There was a partial blockage, a bird's nest half assembled in early October before the bird apparently thought better of its real estate decision. He cleared it in 10 minutes while Evelyn sat at her desk and graded the week's reading exercises and told herself that having a man in her schoolroom did not require her to make conversation. Your girl doing all right? He said from up the small ladder, not looking down. Evelyn's pen stopped. She's fine. Marcus Callahan giving her more trouble? I handle my classroom, Mr. Boone. Silas. I handle my classroom, Silas. A pause. He came down the ladder. He folded it back up and set it against the wall with the care of a man who puts things back where they belong without being asked. He looked at her and she looked at him, and there was a moment where the afternoon light through the fixed window fell across the room at a particular angle, and she was suddenly, inconveniently aware of the silence. Roy Callahan owns the feed store, he said, and the livery, and 2 of the seats on the school board. Evelyn's pen went down. What are you telling me? I'm telling you that Marcus Callahan doesn't come up with those things on his own. He's 10. He's repeating what he hears at the dinner table. She absorbed that, the full weight of it. And the school board, she said carefully, are they looking for a reason to replace me? Not yet. He picked up his coat from the hook by the door. She hadn't noticed him hanging it there, which bothered her. But Roy doesn't let things alone once he's decided on something. Thought you should know what you're dealing with. I appreciate the information, she said. He nodded. He was at the door. Why are you telling me this? She said. Same question she'd asked in the cabin. Different weight this time. He turned. He thought about it. The same genuine pause he'd given it before. The pause of a man who actually considers questions rather than just fielding them. Because you came here with 1 trunk full of books and a 6-year-old, and you're trying to build something, he said. And Roy Callahan has been knocking things down his whole life because it's easier than building. He left. Evelyn sat in the schoolroom for a long time after, with the fixed window and the cleared stovepipe, and the feeling that something in her careful, self-contained situation had developed a crack she hadn't put there herself. She mentioned none of this to Lucy. But Lucy, as previously established, noticed things. Is Silas coming back? She asked that evening, eating the beans and cornbread that constituted most of their evening meals because cornmeal and dried beans were what $40 a month reliably stretched to. I don't know, Evelyn said. Why? Lucy shrugged, which on a 6-year-old is an enormous statement. He fixed the window and the woodpile. And today you said the stovepipe. I didn't say anything about the stovepipe to you. I heard you telling it to yourself when you came in, Lucy said, with the serene accuracy of a child who has been paying attention to their parent since before they had words for it. Evelyn looked at her daughter. You hear a lot of things. You talk to yourself when you think I'm not listening. Lucy pushed a bean around her plate. Mama, does Silas have people? What do you mean? Like family, a wife. Does he have people at his house? Evelyn was quiet a beat too long again. She was going to have to get better at that. I don't know, she said. We haven't talked about that. He said he used to have a little girl, Lucy said. She said it the way she said things she'd been saving, right? Carefully, from a pocket where she'd kept it. What happened to her? I don't know, Lucy. Should we ask him? No, we shouldn't. Lucy considered this. But if something sad happened to him, she said, isn't it lonely not to talk about it? Evelyn set down her fork. She looked at her daughter, this small, serious person who had her father's chin and her grandmother's eyes and some other quality that belonged entirely to herself, a quality that could only be described as being relentlessly, uncomplicatedly interested in the truth. Sometimes, Evelyn said carefully, people need to decide for themselves when they're ready to talk about sad things. Lucy nodded. Like how you put Daddy's picture face down and then put it back. The silence that followed that sentence was the loudest silence in the cabin, possibly in all of Wyoming. Go to sleep soon, Evelyn said, and her voice was steady, which was a genuine achievement under the circumstances. 3 weeks into October, the real cold arrived. Not the scouting dusting, the actual winter, the one the territory meant, with temperatures that hit the floor of the thermometer before sunrise and a wind off the mountains that had no interest in negotiating. The children came to school in everything their families could layer on them, and still the schoolroom was cold enough in the mornings that Evelyn could see her breath until the stove caught and ran an hour. She had asked the school board, meaning Mrs. Prentice, who seemed to be the only member who actually administered anything, about more firewood for the schoolroom. Mrs. Prentice had said she'd bring it up at the next meeting. The next meeting was apparently a month away. On the third Monday of the cold, Evelyn arrived at the schoolhouse at 7 to start the stove before the children came at 8 and found 4 cords of split wood stacked along the north wall of the building, covered with a canvas she didn't own, weighted at the corners with stones. She stood there in the 7 o'clock dark with her lantern, looking at it. A cord of split wood in Mill Haven, Wyoming, cost $3, and physical effort she did not have time for. 4 cords was $12, plus the labor of splitting and stacking, and whoever had done it had been here in the dark because it hadn't been there when she'd left at 5:30 the previous Friday. She knew who had done it. She stood there knowing it for a full minute, the lantern throwing a circle of yellow light in the cold, and felt the crack from before widen in a way that frightened her a little. She went to Silas's ranch that afternoon. She'd gotten the direction from Danny Greaves, who had turned out to be the most useful child in town for the simple reason that he knew where everything was and was surprised anyone wanted to talk to him, and responded to her attention by becoming intensely, loyally helpful. The Boone Ranch was 4 miles east on a road that was more suggestion than fact at this point in the season. She borrowed a horse from the livery, paying for it firmly despite the livery operator's attempt to wave her off, and rode out in the mid-afternoon with the cold sitting hard on her cheekbones. The ranch was not what she'd expected, though she couldn't have said exactly what she had expected. It was working and weathered and organized with the same neatness she'd noticed in the woodpiles. Everything where it needed to be, nothing decorative, nothing wasted, but also nothing neglected. A house, a barn, a bunkhouse that looked like it had seen better decades. 2 horses in the near paddock. A dog of indeterminate ancestry that came out from behind the barn and looked at her with enormous solemnity before deciding she was acceptable and sitting down. Silas came out of the barn when he heard the horse. He looked at her with no surprise, which itself told her something. Either he'd expected this, or he was the kind of man who'd trained himself not to show surprise. She'd been watching him long enough by now to suspect it was some of both. "You didn't have to do that," she said, before she was fully off the horse. He waited until she was on the ground. "Probably not," he said. "I can't accept $12 in wood, Silas." "I didn't spend $12. I spent an evening. There's a difference." "The difference is that I owe you an evening of your time, which is worth more than $12. Something shifted in his face. Not quite amusement. Something adjacent to it, with a kind of respect in the edges. "You want to argue about the math of it?" "I want to pay you back." "For wood?" "For all of it." She held his gaze. The window, the flue, the woodpile at the cabin, the wood at the schoolhouse. That's a substantial amount of... Silas, I don't know what you think you're doing, but I need you to understand that I am not a charity case, and I'm not a woman who... "I know that," he said. Quiet, steady, the kind of quiet that wasn't passive. It was just very certain of itself. She stopped. The cold wind pushed between them. "Then what are you doing?" she said. Lower this time. A real question, not an accusation. He looked out across the paddock for a moment. The 2 horses were standing close together against the wind, the way horses do. "I've got a ranch," he said. "I've got time in the evenings I don't know what to do with. I've got tools and wood, and I know how to fix things." He paused. "You've got a school that was held together with string and hope before you got here, a cabin that should have been replaced 3 years ago, and a little girl who sits in the front row like she intends to learn everything you put in front of her." Another pause. "Seems like a reasonable arrangement. You haven't asked for anything in return." "No, that's..." She stopped. "That makes it harder, not easier." He looked back at her. There was something in his face she hadn't seen clearly before. A kind of weariness that wasn't about today, or this month, or even this year. Old weariness. The kind that comes from something you lost and didn't get back. "I had a daughter," he said. It came out plainly, the way he said most things. "Her name was Clara. She was 8. She and her mother died in the spring of '81. Fever. Same week." He said it like a man reading from a deed. The facts arranged clearly because the facts were all he trusted himself to give. Ranch felt different after, big in the wrong way. Evelyn did not say she was sorry. She had been on the receiving end of enough sorries to know that they cost nothing and changed nothing. She just looked at him and let it sit between them with the weight it deserved. "Lucy asked about you," she said after a moment. "She wanted to know if you had people." Something crossed his face, fast, controlled, but there. "What did you tell her?" "I told her I didn't know." He nodded slowly. He looked down at his boots, then back up. "She's something," he said. "Your girl." "She's her father's daughter," Evelyn said, and it cost her something to say it, in the way that true things sometimes do. "You must have been something too," he said, "for him to be worth missing the way you miss him." She hadn't expected that. She didn't have an answer for it, not one she could deliver without her voice doing things she wasn't prepared for. She looked away, at the horses, at the barn, at the indeterminate dog who had fallen asleep against the fence post. "I should get back," she said. "Lucy will be wondering." "I'll see you in town," he said. Not a question, not a promise, just a statement of fact about the future. She rode back in the declining afternoon light with the cold on her face and Thomas's photograph on the table at the cabin doing the thing it always did, which was simply exist in a way that asked nothing of her, and somehow that was exactly the problem. November arrived, and with it, a change in the social weather of Mill Haven that was harder to predict than the meteorological kind. Word had gotten around, the way word in small towns always got around, which was everywhere, and immediately with whatever distortions made the story more interesting, that Silas Boone was involving himself with the new school teacher. The interpretations varied depending on who was doing the interpreting. Martha Greaves, Danny's mother, and one of the women Evelyn had started to quietly trust, said over the fence one morning, "People are talking." She said it not as a warning, but as information, neutrally delivered. Half of them think it's sweet. Other half think Silas has lost his mind. "Which half do you belong to?" Evelyn asked. Martha thought about this seriously, the way Evelyn was starting to appreciate about her. "I think Silas Boone hasn't done a foolish thing in his life, so I'm inclined to trust his judgment." She paused. "I also think you're doing the thing where you hold yourself very still so nothing can hurt you." Evelyn said nothing. "It's a good strategy," Martha said, "right up until it isn't." Roy Callahan operated differently. He didn't make speeches about it. He was smarter than his behavior on the first day had suggested, or at least cannier. He worked through the school board, raising questions at the general store counter in the hearing of whoever happened to be there. Was the new school teacher conducting herself appropriately? Was it setting the right example for the children, a woman carrying on with a rancher? What did they actually know about her, about the husband, about why she'd ended up all the way out here? Evelyn heard about it through Martha, and then through Danny, and then through the directest possible channel, which was Mrs. Prentice calling her in for what was described as a routine check-in and turning out to be a 15-minute inquisition about whether she was intending to violate the morality clause in her teaching contract. She had, she informed Mrs. Prentice, read the contract thoroughly. She was not conducting a courtship. She was accepting practical assistance from a neighbor. She invited Mrs. Prentice to point to the clause prohibiting the acceptance of firewood. Mrs. Prentice had looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a woman who had been surprised by something and was revising her previous assessment upward. "Well," she'd said, "just so we're clear." "We are perfectly clear," Evelyn said, and left. She went straight from that meeting to the schoolhouse, arrived early, built up the fire with the wood she was no longer apologizing for, and taught 11 children, 14 now, the word had spread about the competent teacher, with the focused, furious energy of a woman who had just been reminded exactly what was at stake. That afternoon, Silas was at the fence again. She'd started not to be surprised by this. He had the next section of wire in his hands, and he was working, and she could have gone inside without stopping. But she stopped. "Roy Callahan's talking to the school board about me," she said, from the schoolhouse step. "I know," he said, without stopping work. "He's using you. Using the fact of you, I mean. Using people seeing you here." "I know that too." "Then maybe—" She stopped, then, more carefully, Maybe it would help if you weren't here as much. He stopped working. He looked at her across the fence with those tired gray eyes. Does it help? He said. You want me to not be here? The honest answer to that question was complicated, and she was not prepared to give it. I'm thinking about Lucy, she said. If the board decides to replace me, they won't replace you, he said. You can't know that. Roy's got 2 seats. There are 5 seats. The other 3 think he's a bully, which he is, and they've been waiting 10 years for someone to handle their classroom the way you handled Marcus on the first week. He went back to the wire. You're not going anywhere, Evelyn. It was the first time he'd used her name without her title in front of anyone who might be watching. She was not sure anyone was watching. She was aware of the possibility more acutely than she had been 30 seconds ago. Still, she said, people are talking. People talked when I bought my ranch, he said. People talked when Clara was born, and Mary and I weren't married yet at the time, which was none of their business then and is none of their business now. People in small towns talk because it's cheaper than entertainment and warmer than going outside. He turned to look at her. Are you asking me to stop coming? She looked at him, then looked at the schoolhouse door, through which, 3 weeks ago, Lucy had walked back in with her chin up and her braids undone because a 10-year-old boy had decided she wasn't worth having a father. No, she said. I'm not. He nodded once, went back to the wire. She went back inside and stood at the fixed window for a moment, looking out at the gray November sky, and let herself feel the thing she'd been not feeling for weeks, which was that somewhere in the past month, without a single conversation about it, without any declaration or negotiation or moment she could point to exactly, she had stopped being a woman who was surviving and started being something else. What that something else was, she wasn't ready to name, but she felt it. She felt it in the way the schoolroom looked different with good wood burning in the stove. She felt it in the way Lucy had started drawing horses in the margins of her reader, which was new, which corresponded to exactly when she had started talking about the horses in the paddock at the Boone Ranch, as though they were personal acquaintances. She felt it in the way she had stopped turning Thomas's photograph face down at night and started being able to look at it straight on. Not without grief, but without the specific guilt of a woman who suspects she might one day stop drowning. On the 3rd Saturday of November, Silas arrived at the cabin not at an off hour or an incidental time, but squarely at 10 in the morning with a horse-drawn sled carrying lumber. He knocked. He did not simply begin. Lucy answered the door. She looked at the lumber, then at Silas, then back at the lumber. Are you building something? She asked. Need to shore up this east wall of the cabin, he said. Cold's getting in through the base. Your mama know it? She knows about the cold, Lucy said, expert witness. She puts rags in the corner. I can do better than rags, he said. Evelyn appeared behind Lucy in the doorway. She looked at the sled. She looked at Silas. She did the brief internal calculation that she always did with him now, the one where she weighed the pride against the practical, the self-sufficiency against the actual temperature of the corner of the room where Lucy slept. You're going to need coffee, she said. This will take most of the day. Something moved across his face. It was small, and it was fast, and it was the closest thing to relief she had ever seen on a man who did not appear to traffic much in visible relief. That'd be fine, he said. Lucy stepped back to let him in, then looked up at her mother with the calm certainty of a child who has been watching things develop for weeks and has long since arrived at a conclusion the adults are still working toward. I'll get the cups, she said. Lucy got the cups. That small gesture, the matter-of-fact way she'd said it, the way she'd gone to the shelf without ceremony, like a child setting a place at the table for someone she'd already decided belonged there, stayed with Evelyn for days afterward. Children didn't perform those things. They either felt them or they didn't. And Lucy, who had her father's chin and her grandmother's eyes and her own particular brand of quiet, serious truth-telling, had clearly already decided something that her mother was still fighting to remain undecided about. Silas worked on the east wall for 6 hours. He didn't talk much while he worked, which Evelyn had come to understand was not coldness, but simply the way he was. A man who gave his full attention to one thing at a time and didn't see the need to fill silence with noise. Lucy sat on an upturned crate near the door for most of the morning, watching him with the focused study she gave to things she wanted to understand. She asked 3 questions total. Where did the cold come in exactly? How did you know which boards to use? Did the horses at his ranch have names? He answered all 3 with the same seriousness he gave to adult questions. Through the gap between the foundation and the floor, he explained. You looked at the grain and the weight, and you pressed with your thumb. The older one was called August. The younger one didn't have a name yet because he hadn't figured out what fit. You have to wait to know, Lucy said. That's right, he said. That's how it is with some things, she said, and went back to watching him work. Evelyn, making coffee at the stove and pretending she hadn't heard every word, set the cups down a little harder than she intended. By the time December came to Millhaven, it came with conviction. The kind of cold that settled into wood and stone and the space between your coat buttons and didn't negotiate. The mountain passes were closing. The road east, which was already more ambition than infrastructure, became impassable for stretches of days at a time. The town contracted into itself the way frontier towns did in winter, people circling their own stoves, commerce slowing, tempers shortening from the friction of too many people spending too much time in too small spaces. The school board held its monthly meeting on the first Tuesday of December. Evelyn was not invited, but she heard about it from Martha Greaves the following morning, delivered with the directness that had become the foundation of their friendship. Roy pushed for a conduct review, Martha said. He wants a formal discussion of your, he called it, inappropriate familiarity with a male citizen of the community. Which citizen? Evelyn said, though she knew. He didn't say the name. Didn't need to. Martha pulled her coat tighter. The other 3 board members told him to sit down. Prentice said the schoolroom was warmer than it had been in a decade, and the children were actually learning to read. And if Roy had a problem with firewood and carpentry, he could take it up with the territory governor. Evelyn absorbed this. So it went nowhere. For now, Martha's voice dropped the comfortable warmth it usually carried. But Evelyn, Roy doesn't forget, and he doesn't give up things he's decided on. Whatever he's decided about you and Silas, it isn't finished. This was the thing about Roy Callahan that Evelyn had been slowly understanding over the past weeks. He wasn't just a bully with a loud mouth. He was a bully with patience, which was a much more dangerous combination. The performance on the first day, the laugh, the comment about Lucy, that had been instinct, reflex, the reflex of a man used to establishing dominance in the first 30 seconds of an encounter. But what came after was calculated. He'd been watching Silas, watching her, letting the observations accumulate. She mentioned it to Silas that Friday when he came by the schoolhouse to check on the stove. Legitimately this time, there had been a problem with the damper in the cold, and he'd said he'd look at it, and he was looking at it, and she was grading papers at her desk and not thinking about Roy Callahan. Roy's running out of legitimate complaints, Silas said from inside the stove access. When that happens, he does one of 2 things. He goes quiet, or he stops being subtle. Which do you think this is? Roy's never gone quiet in his life. He pulled the damper rod, examined it, put it back. He'll try something. What? Don't know yet. He closed the access, looked at her. When he does, don't be alone. Don't engage him directly. Come find me or go to Martha. The instruction settled on her wrong, not because it was bad advice, but because of the familiar tightening it produced in her. The instinct to say she didn't need anyone to handle her problems, that she was managing, that she had been alone for 7 months and had not collapsed. She opened her mouth. I know, he said, before she could get the words out. You can handle yourself. That's not what this is about. She looked at him. Then what is it about? Roy doesn't play fair, he said simply. Neither does a hard winter, and you don't walk out in a blizzard alone just because you're capable of walking. It was such a precise and practical analogy that she couldn't argue with it, which annoyed her slightly, which she recognized was a problem with her, not with the analogy. Fine, she said. Fine, he said. He was at the door before she spoke again. Silas. He stopped. She looked at the papers on her desk for a moment, then at him. What you said, about Roy stopping being subtle. She paused. Are you worried about Lucy? The silence that followed was only a second long, but it had texture. I'm always a little worried about Lucy, he said. She's the most honest person in this town, and this town has a complicated relationship with honesty. Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. So do I, she said. It came out more honestly than she'd planned, a small confession to the floor between them. He left. She sat in the schoolroom with the good fire and the fixed damper and the stack of half-graded papers and the distinct, unwelcome sensation of her own heart making decisions without consulting her. It was Lucy who forced the first real reckoning, as Lucy had a way of doing by simply being what she was. It happened on the second Saturday in December, a day so cold the water in the wash basin had a skin of ice on it when they woke up. Silas had come over. He came most Saturdays now. There was always something that needed doing, and they had stopped pretending the primary reason was the something. And he and Lucy were outside because Lucy had insisted on showing him how she could whistle, a skill she had been developing with serious dedication for 2 weeks and had achieved at the level of intermittent success. Evelyn was at the window watching them. Silas was standing with his hands in his coat pockets and his hat pulled low, and Lucy was blowing with enormous concentration, her cheeks puffed, her eyes fixed on the middle distance. Every third or fourth attempt produced a thin, wavering note. Each time it happened, Silas said something. She couldn't hear through the glass. And Lucy's entire face transformed the way a child's face transforms when they've been seen doing something correctly by someone whose opinion matters to them. That was the thing. That was the precise, specific thing. His opinion mattered to Lucy. And not in the peripheral way that competent adults often matter to perceptive children, as useful sources of information, as safe people to direct questions toward. It mattered the way particular things mattered, the way her father's opinion had mattered, which was the thing Evelyn had been carefully, skillfully, exhaustingly not thinking about since the Saturday Silas had fixed the east wall and Lucy had gotten the cups. She stepped back from the window. She sat down on the bed. She looked at Thomas's photograph, which was face up on the small table, as it had been for the past 3 weeks. She looked at his face, the familiar face, the one she had looked at every day for 9 years, the one she could reconstruct from memory with a fidelity that was both a comfort and an ongoing wound. And she had a conversation with him that was entirely silent and entirely one-sided and absolutely necessary. Thomas had been a good man. Not a perfect one. He had been stubborn in ways that were sometimes infuriating, and he had a temper around money that he'd spent years trying to rein in, and there had been a period, early in their marriage, when he'd prioritized his work over his family in ways she hadn't forgiven quickly. But he had been genuinely good in the ways that mattered, patient with Lucy, honest when it cost him, the kind of person who improved a room by being in it. She had loved him in the settled, lived-in way of two people who had built something real together. What she felt when Silas Boone was in the room was not the same thing. It was smaller, newer, more frightened of itself. But it was not nothing, and it was not going away. And Lucy was outside making thin whistling sounds in the December cold for a man who had quietly, without announcement, become necessary to the fabric of their days. She put Thomas's photograph in the top drawer of the small dresser. Not face down, not hidden, just given its proper place, which was not the table in the main room where she looked at it every evening and prevented herself from moving forward. She closed the drawer. Her hands were steady. When Silas and Lucy came back in, stamping mud off their boots, Lucy's face red with cold and triumph. She had achieved a genuine, sustained whistle on the walk back to the door, and was extremely aware of this accomplishment. Evelyn had coffee ready and said, "Sit down, both of you," in a tone that made Silas read the room with some care before he sat. Lucy sat and wrapped both hands around a cup and beamed. "Silas," Evelyn said, and her voice was level, and she was looking at him directly, which she did not always do, because looking at him directly was something she had been rationing. "I need to ask you something." "All right," he said. Lucy looked between them with her serious eyes. She had the expression of someone watching a play they've already read. "Whatever this is," Evelyn said, and she moved her hand in a gesture that indicated the cabin, the coffee cups, the Saturday morning, the accumulated weight of all the Saturdays. "Whatever you think this is, or wherever you think it's going." She stopped. Restarted. "I have a daughter. I have a job that is already being threatened by a man with an axe to grind. I have... She stopped again. I don't have room to make a mistake, Silas. I cannot afford to let Lucy... The sentence didn't finish, but it didn't need to. He waited until he was sure she was done. You're asking me what my intentions are, he said. Not mockingly, just translating precisely. I'm asking you what you think you're doing, she said. Same question, third time, and this time it had more in it than either of the previous two. More fear, more honesty, more of the things she'd been keeping back. He looked at his coffee cup, then at her. I think, he said slowly, that I've been coming to this cabin on Saturdays because it's the place I most want to be. And I think I've been fixing things and hauling wood because I'm better at doing than at saying. He paused. And I think Lucy is... I think she is the best thing in this town, except possibly her mother. And I think... He stopped. Something moved through his face. I haven't wanted to be careful about anything since Mary and Clara. For 3 years I've been careful. Careful not to want things. Careful not to let things matter. He looked at Evelyn. I don't seem to be able to do that anymore. The room was very quiet. Outside, the wind worked at the eaves. Lucy, who had been sitting with the stillness of a child who knows something important is happening and has decided not to disrupt it, said very quietly, What does careful mean when you say it like that? Silas looked at her. It means I was protecting myself, he said, by not letting anything get important. Lucy thought about this. But we got important, she said. The we was not accidental. It was entirely deliberate. She looked at her mother. Didn't we, Mama? It was not a question. It was a statement from someone who had already arrived at the conclusion and was offering her mother the same road. Evelyn looked at her daughter for a long moment. Then she looked at Silas. Then she did something she almost never did, which was make a decision out loud before she'd finished making it internally. I'm not going to make an emotional decision about this, she said. I have made 2 emotional decisions in my life that I don't regret, which were marrying Thomas and keeping Lucy when the doctor suggested otherwise. She saw Silas's face change slightly on that and didn't explain it. And outside of those 2 things, my emotional decisions have a poor record. All right, Silas said. So I'm not going to tell you how I feel because how I feel is... She stopped. Complicated and probably visible, and not the point. She straightened. I'm going to tell you what I need. Tell me, he said. I need to know that what you said to Lucy on the first day, she said, wasn't just the impulse of a decent man who saw a child being mocked and reacted. I need to know it wasn't something you said in a moment and have been, since then, gently trying to make true by doing things with your hands. The thing he had said to Lucy on the first day. Evelyn hadn't been close enough to hear it. She'd been across the yard when Silas had crouched down to Lucy's level. She'd heard the "what are you doing" from Roy, and then the "go inside Roy," and then she'd been focused on Lucy's face. She hadn't caught what Silas had said to Lucy directly. She knew about it only because Lucy had told her 2 weeks later, mentioned it in the casual way that children mention things that have already been fully absorbed and categorized as permanent truth. He knelt down, Mama. And he said, you have people now. That was what Lucy had reported, verbatim, with the accuracy of a child who had stored it. You have people now. Did you mean it? Evelyn said. Not just the woodpile and the walls. Did you mean what you said to her? Silas was very still. Yes, he said. I meant it. Then here's what I need from you, she said. I need you to understand that if you mean it, if you genuinely mean it, then you are not helping us. You are not doing us a kindness. You are making a choice, and that choice has a little girl's trust attached to it. And a little girl's trust is not something I will allow to be. She pressed her lips together. Broken. Not again. Not by someone she's chosen to let in. He was quiet for long enough that she started to wonder whether she'd gone too far, whether she'd made it sound like an impossibility when she hadn't meant it to sound impossible. She'd meant it to sound serious, because it was serious, because Lucy had already called it we, and that meant it was already too late for casual. What do you want me to do? He said. I want you to keep doing what you're doing, she said, not because I'm asking you to, not because it earns you something, because it's who you are. She held his gaze. And then I want you to come back in the spring and ask me the question you're not asking me now. And by then I'll know if you meant it." Something shifted in his face. Not relief exactly, not victory. It was more like a man who has been carrying something heavy being told he can put it down, but that the path is still long and he'll be carrying it again tomorrow. And that's all right, because the destination is real. "That's a fair condition," he said. "It's the only one I have," she said. Lucy looked at Silas. "What does that mean?" she asked. "Spring is a long time." "It's 4 months," Silas said. "That's very long," Lucy said. "I know," he said, "but your mama's right to ask for it." Lucy considered this. Then, with the particular resignation of a 6-year-old confronting an adult timeline, "Fine, but you can still come on Saturdays." "Lucy," Evelyn started. "He's already coming on Saturdays," Lucy pointed out with perfect accuracy. "That's not the new thing. The new thing is spring." There was a silence, and then Evelyn laughed, and it was the full laugh this time, not the ragged, startled one from the first week, but a real one, with actual warmth in it, and Silas watched it happen with the expression of a man adding something to a list of things he intends to remember. Roy Callahan made his move 8 days before Christmas. Evelyn had stayed late at the schoolhouse. The Christmas recitation was the following week, and the older children were practicing a reading that Danny Greaves, who it turned out had a remarkable memory and a voice that carried, was anchoring. She had lost track of time. The children had all gone home by 5:30. She was gathering her papers in the near dark, the stove burning down, the lamplight low, when the schoolhouse door opened. She thought it was Martha, who sometimes walked up with a lantern when she saw the schoolroom light still burning. It was not Martha. Roy came in with a man she didn't know, heavy-set, quiet, wearing a coat with a county badge on it. And he shut the door behind them and stood there with the deliberate, arranged confidence of someone who has rehearsed. "Mrs. Hart," he said, "this here is Deputy Elias Cole from the county seat. He's got some questions about your husband." Evelyn set her papers down on the desk, very carefully, the way she set the trunk down on the first day. "Does he?" she said. "There were debts," Roy said. "In Ohio. Substantial ones. Money owed to a bank, and there's a question about whether your husband's handling of certain funds was—" He paused, enjoying the pause. "Entirely above board." The deputy looked uncomfortable in a way that suggested this was Roy's arrangement, not his. "My husband," Evelyn said, "died of a heart attack. His debts, which were the result of a failed harvest and a drought year, were settled to the extent that a dead man's estate could settle them, which the bank in question accepted and documented." She held Roy's gaze. "Is the deputy here to confirm that, or did you bring him here to imply something you don't have evidence for?" Roy's smile flickered. He hadn't expected that. He had expected, she could see it in the flicker, he had expected fear, or at minimum the paralysis of a woman caught off guard. She had not been caught off guard because Thomas's financial troubles had been a matter of record, and she had spent the 7 months before coming to Mill Haven organizing every document related to them. "The school board," Roy said, regrouping, "has the right to require full disclosure from employees regarding—" "I've disclosed everything the contract requires," she said. "If the board wants additional documentation, I'll provide it within the week." "Is there anything else?" The deputy cleared his throat. "Ma'am, I apologize for the intrusion. I was told this was a formal inquiry." "It isn't," Evelyn said, still looking at Roy. "It's a fishing expedition." Roy's face hardened. The performance was not going how he'd planned, and he did not like it. And when Roy didn't like things, the pleasantry dropped off fast. "You think you've got yourself set up real nice here," he said, and his voice had lost its civic-minded courtesy entirely. "Think Silas Boone is going to be your little shield against everything. That man has got a dead wife and a dead daughter and a ranch that's half what it used to be, and he is not going to save you if the board decides this school doesn't need a teacher with your kind of baggage." It was the dead wife and dead daughter that did it. Not to Evelyn, to the deputy, who had apparently not known the full context of whatever Roy had told him, and whose expression shifted into something that was clearly reassessment. "Roy," the deputy said, with the measured tone of a man choosing words around a situation he's decided he wants out of, "I think we're done here." Roy looked at him. "We're not done. Yes, sir, the deputy said, with the quiet finality of someone with a badge reminding someone without one how that worked. We are. Roy left. He did not look at Evelyn on the way out. The deputy looked at her once, at the door, a look that was half apology and half something else. Something like the recognition one person extends to another when they've just seen them hold together under pressure that would have cracked someone less prepared. He nodded. She nodded back. The schoolhouse was silent. The stove ticked as it cooled. Evelyn stood behind her desk in the lamplight and let her hands shake, now that there was no one to see them, for about 30 seconds. Then she picked up her papers, put on her coat, and walked out into the December cold. She did not go directly to Silas. She had said she wasn't a woman who needed rescuing, and she intended to keep that specific promise to herself. She went home. She made supper. She helped Lucy with her reading. She waited until Lucy was in the loft and presumably asleep before she sat at the table and let herself feel the full weight of what Roy had said. Not the false inquiry about Thomas's finances, that she'd handled and it wouldn't go anywhere. She was sure of that. Not even the threat about the school board, which had a basis in real vulnerability and needed to be taken seriously. It was the other thing. The way he had used Clara and Mary as ammunition, the way he had reduced Silas's grief to liability, to weakness, to a thing you could weaponize in a cold schoolroom at 6 o'clock in December. She sat there with it until the fire burned low. "Mama," Lucy's voice came from the loft. "You should be asleep." "I know." A pause. "Did something happen today?" "I had a difficult conversation," Evelyn said carefully. "But it's handled." A longer pause. "Was it about us?" She should have said no. She almost said no. "It was about the school," she said, which was technically precise. "Go to sleep, Lucy." Silence from the loft. Then, "Mama? Silas won't stop coming, will he? Even if someone tells him to?" Evelyn looked at the dying fire. She thought about a man who had crossed a street without hurrying, who had said, "Go inside, Roy," with a flatness that carried further than a shout, who had fixed a window latch in the dark before anyone was awake to see him do it. "No," she said. "I don't think he will." "Good," said Lucy from the loft, and went to sleep. The following morning, Evelyn walked to Silas's ranch. She did not go because she needed him to handle anything. She went because she had something to tell him, the full account of the previous evening, clearly and without dramatizing. And because she had decided that telling him was not dependence, it was information, and people who were building something needed the same information. He listened to all of it without interrupting. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment, the way he was quiet when he was actually thinking rather than stalling. "He'll push harder now," Silas said, "because it didn't work." "I know." "He's going to go after the board directly, try to make the case that the school is being, he'll use words like compromised. Use your name and mine together in a way that sounds like something it isn't." "I know that too," she said. "I've been thinking about how to handle it." "What did you come up with?" She looked at him. "I came up with the fact that the best thing I can do is be exactly what I am," she said. "A good teacher with a clean record and a daughter who is thriving in a school that's working. And let Roy's version of events compete with the actual events and see which one wins." Silas looked at her for a long moment with those gray eyes. "That's right," he said. "That's exactly right." "I know," she said. "I just needed to say it out loud to someone who wasn't going to argue with me." The corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile, but it was what Silas Boone produced in the direction of a smile, and she had learned to read it, and it did the thing she'd been not letting it do for weeks. She walked home with the cold at her back and 4 months of winter still ahead of her, and Roy Callahan's next move somewhere in the future where she couldn't see it yet. And for the first time since October, she didn't feel like a woman driving ahead of something terrible. She felt like a woman walking toward something she hadn't fully named, on a road she hadn't chosen but had decided, deliberately and with her eyes open, to stay on. 4 months. That was what she'd asked for. And winter in Wyoming had a way of making 4 months feel like a sentence you served rather than time you simply passed through. January came down hard, the kind of January that froze the pump handles solid by 6 in the morning and turned the walk from the cabin to the schoolhouse into a negotiation with the wind that you didn't always win. Evelyn won it every day. She was at the schoolhouse before 7, stove running before 8, and she taught her 17, now 19, two more families had enrolled after the Christmas recitation. With the steady, unglamorous dedication of a woman who had decided this was her work, and her work was going to be done correctly regardless of what the weather or Roy Callahan had to say about it. The Christmas recitation had been, by any honest measure, remarkable. Danny Greaves had stood at the front of the schoolroom and read the anchor passage with a voice that didn't waver once, and afterward his mother had cried in the back row, and his father, a man Evelyn had not yet met because he worked the mine and kept hours that didn't intersect with civilization, had shaken her hand at the door with a grip that communicated an entire paragraph of gratitude without a word spoken. The room had been full. Parents, townspeople, even two ranchers who'd ridden in from the outlying spreads because word had traveled. The way good things occasionally travel in small towns, which was faster than scandal and with more accuracy. Roy Callahan had not come. His absence was its own kind of statement, and the room had been better for it. Silas had sat in the back. He hadn't announced himself. He'd come in after the room filled and found a place near the wall and stood there with his hat in his hands and watched Lucy recite her 3 lines, which she did with the composure of a diplomat and the volume of someone who had been told 3 times to project. And when it was over and the room was moving and shuffling and people were finding their coats, Evelyn had looked across the room and found his eyes without trying to find them. He'd nodded. She'd nodded back. It was the same nod they'd exchanged through the schoolyard fence in October, but it carried more now than it had then, the way the same gesture accumulates meaning across the months. That was December. January was where things got harder. Not between them. That had settled into something consistent, if unresolved. Saturdays at the cabin. The occasional evening when he stopped by the schoolhouse with something practical that needed doing and stayed past the practical thing for coffee and conversation that moved, more often now, away from repairs and weather and into the territory of actual people talking about actual things. She told him about Thomas, that not the grief of it, which she'd shared already in small measures, but the person of it, the specific Thomasness of the man she'd married. How he'd pronounced particular words wrong and refused to be corrected about it. How he'd been a better cook than her and had known it and been insufferably pleased about it. How he'd been afraid of horses, which she found out on their 2nd month of marriage and which had been a significant surprise given that he'd grown up on a farm in Indiana. Silas had listened to all of it without the discomfort that some people carried when the dead were described with specificity rather than reverence. He'd ask questions, real ones, not the polite ones people asked when they were managing you. What did he do about the horses? He avoided them, she'd said. Managed to lose an entire bet at a county fair because he wouldn't get near the corral. Silas had almost smiled. She'd watched him almost smile and felt the pull of it and said nothing about that at all. He'd talked about Mary once, just briefly, a Tuesday evening when Lucy had gone up to the loft early and the fire was running low and neither of them had moved to bank it yet. Mary had been from Illinois, he said. She'd had opinions about everything and delivered them with a precision that he'd found terrifying when they were courting and indispensable after they were married. She had laughed at the wrong moments in serious conversations, and he had loved this about her. She'd wanted 3 children, and they'd had Clara, and then the winter after Clara there had been a difficult pregnancy that hadn't gone to term, and then the spring with the fever had come before they'd tried again. He said it all with the same plains flat delivery, the facts in their sequence, but she could hear what was underneath it the way you hear water under ice, present, moving, cold with the weight of what had stopped. "I'm sorry," she said. She had promised herself she wouldn't say that. It came out anyway. "I know," he said. Same as she'd said to Lucy in the schoolyard. Same weight. The thing about January was what it did to Roy Callahan. Roy had been, since the failed visit with the deputy, operating with a restraint that was clearly costing him. The patience she'd identified in him, the patience of a man who calculated rather than just performed, was visible in the way he'd gone quiet publicly while continuing, she was certain, to work the quieter channels. She heard about it in pieces. A comment to the feed store owner about the school's heating costs and whether the community was truly getting value. A conversation at the barbershop about standards for frontier educators. Nothing actionable, nothing she could directly address. Just a low, consistent pressure, the kind that was meant to erode rather than break. She held, she taught. She kept her record clean and her classroom full, and her conduct precisely, deliberately, boringly above reproach. What Roy hadn't counted on, what he seemed genuinely unable to factor in, was Silas. Not Silas as a romantic interest, which was the angle Roy kept trying to work. Silas as a member of the community. Because in the 4 years since Mary and Clara had died, Silas Boone had drawn himself in. He'd worked his ranch, he'd done his business in town, he'd been present without being particularly social. People had respected this and kept a certain distance that he'd seemed to prefer. What they had not fully registered, apparently, was the quality of his character. Because character requires context to become visible, and he hadn't given context. What he was giving now was context. He was at the Christmas recitation. He was at the January town meeting, not speaking, just present, which was itself a statement in a town where his presence had become notable. When a chimney fire broke out at the Aldrich family's house on a Tuesday morning in the middle of January, sending both twins to school in borrowed coats that didn't fit, Silas had a cord of wood and a man from his ranch to help with the repair to the Aldrich chimney by the following afternoon. He hadn't announced it. The Aldriches had told people, the way people told things in small towns, and what spread was not a story about a man currying favor, but a story about a man who had simply done what needed doing. Roy had been trying to paint Silas as a man making foolish decisions about a woman with baggage. What Roy was discovering was that the town was instead watching a man make very clear decisions about what mattered, and that it was hard to argue with the outcomes. "He's losing ground," Martha told Evelyn on a Thursday in late January, over tea at the Greaves kitchen table, which had become their regular arrangement. Not losing it loud, but the people he'd been working on. The Aldriches are done with him. The Pearson family, too, after Silas helped them with the blocked well last month. "He'll find a new angle," Evelyn said. "Probably," Martha agreed, "but the angles are getting fewer." Evelyn wrapped her hands around her cup. "Martha, when this is over, however it ends, what does this town look like? For Lucy? For the school?" Martha was quiet for a moment, the serious quiet she used when she was being honest rather than comforting. "Better than when you came," she said. "You've already changed things, Evelyn. Not dramatically. But the school is different. The way people talk about their children and education, it's different. Danny Greaves is reading at a level his parents didn't think was possible for him. The Aldrich girl is doing mathematics that her father can't follow." She paused. "That matters. That stays regardless of Roy." Evelyn nodded slowly. "I need it to be enough," she said. "On its own. The school. I need it to be enough that I'm here for the right reasons, not just because—" She stopped. "Not just because of Silas," Martha said. "Yes." Martha looked at her steadily. "It is," she said. "You know it is. You've been here since October and you haven't had a single bad week in the classroom, which is more than anyone in this town expected. The Silas situation is separate from that. It's complicated, but it's separate." "Is it, though?" Evelyn said. Not rhetorically. She actually wanted to know. Martha thought about it. "The school is yours," she said. "Whatever happens with Silas, whatever it becomes or doesn't become, the school is yours. You built that. He didn't build it for you." Evelyn sat with that for a moment and let it do its work. The crisis, when it came, arrived on a Thursday afternoon in the first week of February, in a form no one had predicted because Roy Callahan had, as Silas had warned, stopped being subtle. He came to the school board not with insinuation, but with a document. A letter, he said, from the Ohio bank that held Thomas Hart's former debt, stating that the debt had not been fully settled and that there was a remaining balance of $214 that had been deferred rather than discharged. The letter was real. Evelyn could see that immediately when Mrs. Prentice brought it to her, her expression carefully neutral in the way of someone delivering difficult news they didn't fully understand. The letter was real and the debt was real, and Evelyn knew exactly what it was. It was the deferred portion, the portion the bank had agreed to suspend when she'd left Ohio because there were no assets left to attach, a standard arrangement that a careful reading of the document she had filed would reveal immediately. But Roy hadn't brought it to Evelyn first. He'd brought it to the board. He'd put it on the table and said she'd misrepresented her financial situation in her contract disclosure, which was the kind of statement that, attached to a real document, could look credible to people who weren't going to sit down and read the full underlying paperwork. Evelyn was summoned to the next board meeting. She was given 5 days. She told Silas that evening. She had walked to the ranch at 4:30 with the letter copy in her coat pocket and the specific cold feeling in her chest that came not from fear of the outcome. She knew the outcome was manageable, but from the sheer exhaustion of a man with resources and patience using them against her with complete indifference to what it cost her or her daughter. Silas read the letter twice. He looked up. "Do you have the bank's deferral agreement?" "In Ohio," she said. "With my sister. I'd need to write to her to have it sent." "How long will that take?" 2 weeks if the postal road is clear, longer if it isn't." He was quiet, working the problem. "The meeting's in 5 days." "Yes." "Can you write to your sister today? Get the letter out on tomorrow's mail?" "Yes, but it might not arrive in time." He nodded, set the letter down. "Then you tell the board exactly what the deferral arrangement is and where the documentation is, and that it's incoming. You've got nothing to hide, and hiding it would be the only thing that actually creates a problem." "I know that," she said. Her voice was shorter than she meant it to be. She caught it. "I know that, I just—" She stopped, looked at her hands. "I am so tired of this," she said. The words came out with more rawness than she'd intended, and she didn't have the energy to smooth them back. "I came here to teach, that's all. I came here to teach and give Lucy a roof and build something small and functional and—" She stopped again, her jaw tightened. "I am so tired of defending the fact that Thomas died and left debts, and I am a woman alone, and that makes me a target for every man who needs something to stand on top of." The room was quiet. The dog came in from the cold and lay down near the stove. "I know," Silas said. Same as before, same 2 words, but he said them differently this time, with a weight to them that wasn't sympathy, which she didn't want, but was something closer to solidarity, which she hadn't known she needed until she felt it. "I don't want you to fix it," she said, looking at him. "I want you to know that I know how to fix it myself." "I know that too," he said, "and I want you to be— I want—" She stopped. Something cracked in her voice on the 3rd stop, and she pressed her lips together and held it. She had not cried in front of him. She had not cried in front of anyone since Ohio. She was not going to start now over Roy Callahan's paperwork. Silas stood up from the table. He crossed to where she was sitting. He didn't say anything. He put his hand over hers on the table. Just that. Just his hand over hers, warm and calloused and present. And he didn't say anything because there was nothing to say that improved on the gesture. She let him keep his hand there for about 15 seconds. Then she straightened her spine and said, "I'm going to write to my sister tonight." "I'll get you paper and ink," he said, and went to get it. The board meeting 5 days later was the most important 40 minutes of Evelyn's tenure in Mill Haven, and she walked into it having slept 4 hours the previous night because the postal response hadn't come. The road was unclear, and she was going in with her account of the deferral arrangement and her own documentation of the original debt settlement without the specific letter she needed to make it airtight. Roy was there, which he was not normally entitled to be, but which no one had objected to because Roy had a way of establishing his presence in proceedings before anyone remembered to question whether he belonged. He sat to the side with a self-satisfied stillness that Evelyn recognized as the posture of a man who had already decided how the next hour went. She presented clearly. She explained the deferral, the circumstances, the documentation that was in transit. She was factual and methodical, and she watched the 3 board members who were not Roy's listen. With the attention of people who were trying to be fair and finding it not particularly difficult because she was giving them clean, honest material to work with. Roy waited until she finished. "The question," he said in his civic-minded voice, the one he used when he wanted to sound like a reasonable man asking a reasonable thing, "is whether the failure to disclose this outstanding balance constitutes a violation of the employment contract, regardless of the reason for the balance." Mrs. Prentice looked at him over her glasses. "The contract requires disclosure of legal judgments against the employee." A deferred debt with no legal judgment attached is not a judgment, Roy. Roy's jaw tightened, barely. The spirit of the disclosure requirement. I'm not in the business of spirits, Mrs. Prentice said, with the dry finality of a woman who had been running practical affairs in Mill Haven for 20 years and had heard enough invocations of spirit to last several lifetimes. I'm in the business of what the contract says. The meeting ended without a resolution against Evelyn. Not with a resounding endorsement either. Mrs. Prentice said the documentation should be provided when it arrived, which was reasonable, and the meeting adjourned. Evelyn walked out into the February cold. Roy was behind her. She heard him on the step and kept walking. "This isn't finished," he said to her back. Not a threat. A statement of fact about himself, which was more honest than most things he said. She stopped. She turned. She looked at him in the thin February light, this man who had been using his considerable patience and resources to grind her down for 4 months, and she felt a number of things. Anger, mostly, and underneath it something sadder and more complicated. The particular grief of people who use their strength to diminish rather than build. "Roy," she said, "I have 19 children in that schoolroom. 2 of them could barely read when I arrived. Danny Greaves is doing mathematics. The Aldrich girl is writing her own letters. Whatever you think about me or Silas or my husband's finances, those children are learning. And you are spending your winter trying to stop that." She held his gaze. "What does that say about you?" "Not about me. About you." Roy said nothing. She hadn't expected him to. Some things don't have answers, they just have the space where the answer should be. She walked home. The letter from her sister arrived 11 days later, with the complete deferral documentation exactly as Evelyn had described it. She filed it with the school board. Mrs. Prentice noted it on the record. The matter was formally closed. But something else happened in those 11 days that turned out to matter more than the documentation. On the Sunday between the board meeting and the letter's arrival, Marcus Callahan came to the schoolhouse. Not during school hours, on a Sunday, alone, which meant he'd made a deliberate decision without his father knowing about it. He knocked. Evelyn answered. He was standing on the step in his good coat, his hat in his hands, his expression arranged into something that was clearly uncomfortable and clearly intentional. "Mrs. Hart," he said, "I wanted to—" He stopped. He was 10. 10 was too young to know exactly how to say what he'd apparently decided needed to be said. "I was mean to Lucy," he said finally. "Back in October, I said something mean." Evelyn looked at him. She did not make it easier. He'd come here on his own, and he needed to finish it on his own. "I know what you said," she told him. He nodded. His ears were red. "My pa says things, and I said what he says. And it wasn't—" He stopped again. "It wasn't mine to say. It wasn't true." "No," Evelyn said. "It wasn't." "I'm sorry," he said. "Is Lucy—" "Can I tell her?" She studied him for a moment. A 10-year-old boy who had walked over here on a Sunday because something in him had decided it needed correcting. Roy Callahan's son, who was not Roy Callahan. Not yet. Maybe not ever. "Come back tomorrow before school," she said. "You can talk to her then." He nodded, replaced his hat, and went back down the step. She watched him go and thought about the way things moved, how a community changed not through dramatic reversals, but through small shifts in individuals. A boy who'd heard something cruel and repeated it, deciding, at 10, that it had been wrong. Lucy, when told the next morning, had listened to Marcus with the seriousness she gave to all meaningful conversations. He'd said his piece, stumbling through it. She'd listened until he finished. "Okay," she said. "You can sit next to me at recess if you want." Marcus had looked faintly stunned, the way people sometimes looked when forgiveness arrived more simply than they'd prepared for. "Okay," he said. They'd gone out to the schoolyard together. Evelyn watched through the window and felt something shift in the way a long, stuck thing finally moves. Not dramatically, not with fanfare, just the quiet release of something that had been held too long in one position. She told Silas about Marcus that Saturday. He was at the cabin. There was always something at the cabin. February had been hard on the place, and he'd been shoring up the roof edge where ice had worked under the shingles. He listened to the Marcus story from the ladder, not stopping work. Roy's losing Marcus, he said. Maybe, she said. Or Marcus is just 10, and he made a decision on his own. Silas came down the ladder. That's the same thing, he said. Roy's been the loudest voice Marcus hears his whole life. When a boy starts making decisions that go against the loudest voice in the room, it's because someone else got in. Something else. He looked at her. You got in. The school got in. Evelyn looked at the sky, February blue, thin and cold. It's not enough, she said, to fix a family from outside it. No, he agreed, but it's something, and sometimes something is all there is. She looked back at him. He was standing on the ground with the ladder against the cabin wall and the ice melt running off the roof edge in small, irregular drips. And he had that expression he sometimes got when he'd said something that cost him. Not performed cost, genuine cost, the kind that came from real places. You're talking about more than Marcus, she said. I'm talking about all of it, he said. What you do here matters. The school, the kids, all of it. It mattered before I was part of it, and it would matter if I weren't, he paused. I want you to know I know that. She understood what he was doing. He was confirming in his plain way, without speeches, that he had heard what she'd said in December. That she needed the school to be hers on its own terms, not scaffolded by his presence. He was telling her he understood the distinction. I do know that, she said. Good, he said, and went back up the ladder. March arrived slowly, the way March arrived in Wyoming, grudgingly, a few degrees at a time, with frequent reminders that it hadn't fully committed to anything yet. The snow on the passes was still 3 feet deep. The road east was passable on a good week and impassable on a bad one. But the light was changing, doing the thing it did in early spring when the angle shifted and the afternoons started carrying warmth again instead of just light. Lucy noticed it first, which was appropriate. The snow's going to melt, she announced at breakfast one morning in mid-March, as though reporting a discovery of personal significance. Eventually, Evelyn said, it smells different outside, like something wet under the cold. That's the ground, Evelyn said, starting to think about it. Lucy absorbed this. Mama, she said, spring is coming. It is. A pause. Lucy was watching her with a careful expression. You said spring, she said. You said in spring. Evelyn set down her coffee cup. She looked at her daughter, 6 going on 7, and old in the ways that mattered and still entirely a child in the ways that needed protecting, and looking at her mother right now with the clear eyes of someone keeping a very precise internal account. I did say that, Evelyn said. Is it going to happen? Evelyn was quiet for a moment. Out the window, the March light was doing its new thing, angled and warmer. She thought about the drawer with Thomas's photograph in it, closed but not locked, not hidden. She thought about the east wall, repaired, solid against the cold that was finally, slowly beginning to release. She thought about a man on a ladder and coffee on Saturday mornings, and the particular way Lucy drew horses in her reader margins with the serene confidence of a child who expects to know them better soon. Yes, she said, I think it is. Lucy nodded, satisfied, the way she nodded when something she'd already decided turned out to be confirmed. She went back to her breakfast. 2 weeks later, Roy Callahan came to the schoolhouse one final time. It was a Wednesday afternoon, children gone. Evelyn alone with the last of the day's grading. He knocked this time, which she registered as a change. She opened the door. He looked different, not diminished exactly. Roy Callahan was not the kind of man who diminished easily, but recalibrated. There was less of the performance in his face. What was left was harder to categorize. The board's renewed your contract, he said. 3-year term. Prentice pushed it through. She waited. I want you to know, he said, and then stopped. Whatever he'd intended to follow that with, it seemed to require more than he'd brought. Marcus has been different, he said finally. At home, he's been reading, which he didn't before. He said it with the stiff, awkward honesty of a man unaccustomed to giving credit for things he'd fought against. My wife says it's the school. It's Marcus, Evelyn said. He made the choice. Roy looked at her for a long moment. Something worked in his jaw. "I haven't been fair to you," he said. The sentence came out like a thing he'd been carrying a long distance and was finally setting down. She could have said many things. She said, "No, you haven't." He nodded once. He left. She stood in the doorway and watched him go down the main street of Millhaven in the late March afternoon. A man who had spent his winter trying to burn down something real and had found, at the end of it, that real things were harder to burn than he'd remembered. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt the quiet, slightly exhausted satisfaction of something that had finally stopped requiring all her energy and left her hands free for something else. She closed the schoolhouse door and went home. Saturday came. Silas came with it. The March morning was cold but different. The cold that had quality now, that had somewhere to go, that wasn't settling in for permanent residency. Lucy was in the yard before he arrived, looking for the first mud under the remaining snow with the focused attention of a scientist pursuing a hypothesis. He came up the road with his coat open, first time she'd seen it open since October, and Lucy spotted him before Evelyn did and yelled his name in the particular way she'd developed over the months, which was not asking for his attention so much as announcing that she had registered his existence and found it acceptable. He raised a hand in response and walked up to where Evelyn was standing at the cabin door with 2 cups of coffee, and she handed him one, and they stood there for a moment in the March light watching Lucy crouch in the snow and report on the condition of the ground underneath it. "Roy came to the school," Evelyn said. "I heard," Silas said. 3-year contract." "I heard that too." She looked at him. "You didn't arrange that." "Prentice doesn't need arranging," he said. "She knows what she's looking at." They stood with their coffee. Lucy found something in the snow worth examining closely and bent over it with total concentration. "Silas," Evelyn said. It's March." He looked at her. He understood what she meant. She could see him understand it, the way his stillness changed quality, became alert without becoming anxious. "Not quite spring yet," he said, carefully. "No," she said. "Not quite." He looked at Lucy, then back at Evelyn. He had his coffee cup in both hands and his coat open, and the morning light coming across him the way morning light came across things it had been away from for several months and was getting reacquainted with. "How close?" he said. She looked at the sky, at the light that was doing its new thing, at her daughter examining the ground with complete conviction that something was about to grow. "Close," she said. He nodded. He drank his coffee. He didn't push it, didn't reach for it, didn't take the inch she'd given and try to make it a mile. He just stood there with the patience that was not strategy but simply who he was, this man who had learned the hard way that some things could not be hurried and had believed it enough to wait. It was that, exactly that quality, that specific restraint, that broke the last piece of what she'd been holding. She would not tell him today. Today was close, but not yet. She'd said spring, and she meant spring, and she was, if nothing else, a woman who meant what she said. But she let herself stand there in the March morning and feel it fully. What it was, what it had been becoming since October, what it would be when she finally let it. And she did not turn away from it, or file it, or manage it, or name it carefully from a distance. She just felt it. The way you feel the first real warmth of the year when you've been through a hard winter, and you didn't know, all those months, whether warmth was still a thing the world was capable of producing. It was. It still was. Lucy stood up from her examination of the ground and turned around with snow on her knees and the expression of a scientist whose hypothesis has been confirmed. "It's coming," she announced. "The mud. It's right there under the white part. It's just waiting." "Oh, everything's waiting for something," Evelyn said. Lucy looked at her, then at Silas with the calm eyes of a child who has been right about this for months. "I know," she said, in the tone of someone who had known for a very long time and was simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. The mud came first. That was how spring arrived in Wyoming, not with flowers or birdsong or any of the gentler announcements that spring made in softer parts of the country. It came with mud, deep, honest, boot-swallowing mud that meant the ground had finally relented and let the frost out, and that the world was grudgingly, beginning again. Lucy had been right about it being close. She was right about most things that involved patient observation and a willingness to crouch in the cold and look carefully at what was actually there rather than what you expected to see. She got that from Thomas, the looking carefully part. Evelyn was beginning to think she might have gotten the patients from somewhere else entirely. The last week of March brought mud and then a hard rain that turned the main street of Millhaven into something between a road and a river, and kept the school attendance down to 11 for 3 days while families with outlying properties waited for the water to make up its mind about where it was going. Evelyn taught the 11 who came with the same effort she gave the 19, which was the only way she knew how to do it. Danny Greaves was there every day, rain or mud or anything else, because the school had become the place where Danny Greaves was good at something, and a boy who has found a place where he is good at something will cross a river to get there. On the 4th day, when the rain had moved east and the road had reasserted itself as a road rather than a waterway, she had all 19 back plus one. A girl named Petra, 8 years old, the daughter of a homesteader named Werner Scholl, who had taken a parcel 6 miles south and apparently spent the winter watching his daughter pace their one-room homestead with the restless energy of a child who needed more than chores and conversation to fill a mind that size. He brought her in himself on a mud-caked horse and handed her down to Evelyn at the schoolhouse door like something precious he'd been holding too long. "She reads already," he said, in the accented English of a man who had learned it as an adult and used it with careful deliberation. "But she needs more." "I'll give her more," Evelyn said. He nodded. He looked at the schoolhouse with an expression she recognized. It was the same expression Danny's father had used when he'd shaken her hand at the Christmas recitation. Not gratitude exactly, though it was that too. It was recognition. The recognition of a person who understands that something they cannot fully provide is being provided by someone else, and that this is not a failure on their part, but simply a fact of what communities are supposed to do for each other. She watched him ride back south through the mud and thought about Roy Callahan standing on the schoolhouse step in February, telling her that Marcus had been reading. She thought about 3-year contracts and fixed windows and 4 cords of wood stacked under a canvas she hadn't owned. She thought about how a community changed, not the dramatic way, not all at once, but this way. One Petra at a time, one Werner Scholl trusting a school teacher at a door, one Danny Greaves crossing whatever needed crossing to be where he could be competent. Spring was doing its work. Silas came on the first Saturday in April when the air had crossed over into something that could honestly be called warm, and the pasture behind the Boone Ranch had gone from brown to the kind of tentative green that looks almost uncertain of itself, like it isn't sure yet whether it's been given permission. He came to the cabin at 10, the usual time, but he came without a project. No lumber, no wire, no practical purpose she could identify on the sled. Just him, on horseback, in his coat that was open again in the new way of the new season. Lucy was at Martha Greaves's house for the morning. Martha had started what she called a Saturday baking arrangement with 3 of the other women's children, which was part baking instruction and part giving their mothers a few hours of quiet, and Lucy attended with the seriousness she brought to any activity that involved learning to make something. So it was just the 2 of them, which had happened before but less often, and the quality of the alone was different today because they both knew what today was adjacent to. She had said spring. It was April. The mud was here. The green was tentative but real. He sat at the table and she poured coffee, and neither of them said anything about any of that immediately, because that was also who they were. People who didn't rush the important things. "Petra Scholl started school this week," she said. "I heard." Werner came into the feed store. He looked like a man who'd set down a heavy thing. He did look like that, she agreed. Silas turned his cup in his hands. He had big hands, scarred across the knuckles from decades of the particular work of running a ranch in hard country. She had noticed his hands more than she'd intended to over the winter, the way they moved with a competence that was so habitual it had stopped being something he performed and just become something he was. "Roy Callahan's selling the feed store," Silas said. She looked up. "What?" "Put it up last week. He's been talking about Cheyenne for months, apparently. His wife has family there." He paused. "I think the winter wore him down. Not just the school board thing, just..." He moved a hand. Some people want a smaller life than the one they've been trying to live. Evelyn absorbed this. She thought about what she'd said to Roy on the step in February. What does this say about you, not about me? And whether it had done any work on him, or whether it was simply the accumulation of a winter's failures that had made Cheyenne look appealing. She supposed it didn't matter which. He was going. Marcus was reading. Those were the facts. Does Marcus know yet? She asked. Don't know. He paused. He'll be all right. He's a different kid than he was in October. He is, she said. The morning light came through the fixed window at an angle that had been impossible in winter, the sun finally high enough to clear the hill east of town and reach the cabin at this hour. It put a warm rectangle on the floor that the cat, they had acquired a cat in February, or the cat had acquired them, it was difficult to say, was lying in with the absolute commitment that cats bring to warmth. Evelyn, Silas said. It's April. She looked at him across the table. He was looking at her with those gray eyes that did different things in different light, and in this light, the April light, they looked. She didn't have a clean word for it. Clear, maybe. Clear in the way that things looked after a long winter when the air was finally honest again. It is, she said. You said spring, he said. Not pressuring her, just locating them in the timeline she'd set, putting the marker down precisely where it belonged. I did, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he set his coffee cup down and he looked at her, and he said simply, without ceremony or performance, I want to ask you something. I've been thinking about how to say it for 4 months, and I've decided the thinking hasn't helped much, so I'm going to just say it. All right, she said. Her voice was steady. She was surprised it was steady. I want to build something with you, he said. I don't mean the cabin or the schoolhouse. I mean something that has your name and my name in the same sentence, and that lasts. He paused. I want to marry you, if you'll have me. And I want Lucy to know that the thing I said to her on the first day was not something I said in a moment. It's something I've been making true every day since, and I intend to keep making it true for as long as she'll let me. He stopped. He looked at her. That's what I want. I'm asking if it's what you want. The room was very quiet. The cat adjusted itself in the sun. Outside something, a bird, the first one she'd heard in months, tested a note and then went quiet again. She had thought about this conversation. She had thought about it in the December dark and the January cold and the February board meeting and every Saturday morning when she'd handed him coffee and stood in the doorway and felt the thing she'd been not naming gather itself into something too large and too specific to keep treating as ambiguous. She had prepared herself for how it would feel when it arrived. She had not, it turned out, fully prepared herself. Because the actual moment of a thing is never quite the shape of the imagined one, and what she felt sitting across the table from Silas Boone in the April morning was not the composed, clear-eyed readiness she'd rehearsed, but something messier and more human. A complicated wash of grief and want and fear, and something that was not joy exactly, but was the structure that joy was built on, the ground level of it, the honest, undecorated foundation. I need to tell you something first, she said. He waited. I love Thomas, she said. I want you to know that I'm not saying yes to you because I'm lonely or because it's practical or because Lucy needs a father figure, though all three of those things are real. She held his gaze. I'm saying yes because somewhere between October and April, I stopped being a woman who was surviving and became a woman who wanted something specific. And the specific thing I want has your name on it. She paused. But Thomas was real, and what we had was real. And I'm not going to pretend otherwise, or feel guilty for stopping pretending it was enough on its own. I don't want you to pretend otherwise, he said. Mary was real too. I know. We're both bringing the whole of it, he said. Not just the good parts, all of it. Yes, she said. That's what I'm saying yes to. The whole of it. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. The same as February? The same gesture, but carrying more now, carrying the spring and the whole winter behind it, and the 4 months of demonstrated evidence that a man meant what he said, not because he declared it once, but because he kept showing up. Yes, she said again, because it deserved to be said twice, and clearly, without ambiguity. His hand tightened on hers. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. After a moment, she said, "Lucy's going to be insufferable about this." A real smile crossed his face then, a full one, which she had seen exactly twice before, and which transformed his whole face in a way that she'd been cataloging without meaning to. "She's been waiting since November," he said. "I know," Evelyn said. "She told me. In December. She said, and I quote, 'Mama, it's just math.'" Silas laughed. An actual laugh, full and real, and she felt the sound of it do something to the quality of the air in the room, the way a door opening changes the quality of a space that has been closed. They went to get Lucy together, walked the 3 blocks to the Greaves house in the April morning with the mud drying at the edges of the road and the first real warmth of the year sitting on their shoulders. And they were not holding hands because they had not yet had the conversation about what was appropriate in public view in Millhaven. But they were walking close enough together that anyone watching from the window of the general store, and someone was always watching from the window of the general store, could have formed an accurate conclusion. Lucy was at the Greaves kitchen table with flour on her nose and a look of deep concentration over a pie crust that was fighting her. She looked up when they came in together, both of them, through the same door at the same time, and her flour-dusted face did a rapid assessment that was, for a 7-year-old, an impressively sophisticated piece of reading. "Did it happen?" she said. "Lucy," Evelyn said. "Did it happen?" she said again, directly to Silas. Silas crouched down to her level, the same as the first day, the same position, but this time without the scaffolding of a public scene or a crying child's pride to protect. Just the two of them at eye level, with flour on her nose. "It happened," he said. Lucy looked at him for a moment. Then she did something unexpected. She leaned forward and put both her floury hands on his face, the way small children touch the faces of people they are completely certain of, and she looked at him with her serious dark eyes, her father's eyes, and she said, "I knew you were going to be my people." He put his hands over hers. The flour transferred to his face. He didn't seem to notice or mind. "I knew too," he said. "First day." Lucy dropped her hands and turned to Martha Greaves, who was standing at the stove doing a poor job of pretending she hadn't heard all of this. "Mrs. Greaves," Lucy announced, "Silas is going to be my father." Martha turned from the stove and looked at Evelyn with an expression that was half triumph and half the particular warmth of a woman who has been watching something right happen and has the satisfaction of being present when it finally does. "Well," she said, "the pie crust can wait." They stayed for an hour. Martha made more coffee, and the pie crust was abandoned in favor of cake, which Lucy strongly preferred anyway, and Danny Greaves came in from outside with mud on his boots and performed a rapid understanding of the situation and then sat in the corner eating cake and saying nothing, which was, Evelyn thought, the correct response. The walk home was the 3 of them. Silas on Lucy's left and Evelyn on her right, and Lucy in the middle, holding both their hands with the comfortable authority of a child who has been the organizing principle of 2 people's lives for months and is now formalizing the arrangement. She swung their hands. She did not talk, which was unusual. She was processing in the way she processed large things, internally and thoroughly. At the cabin door, she looked up at Silas and said, "Can I see August and the other horse?" "The one without a name," he said. "You said you hadn't figured out what fit," she said. "Maybe I can help." "Maybe you can," he said. She went inside to get her coat, and Evelyn stood at the door and looked at Silas, and he looked at her, and neither of them said anything because there wasn't anything to say that was more eloquent than the morning, which had been about as eloquent as a morning could get. They went to the ranch that afternoon, all 3 of them. Lucy went directly to the paddock with the focused intention of a child with a naming project to complete. August, the older horse, received her with the calm resignation of an animal who had been around long enough to understand that small humans sometimes needed to lean on fence rails and stare at you, and that this was fine. The younger horse was more uncertain. He moved around the paddock with the specific restlessness of an animal that had not yet decided what to make of the world, which was, Lucy observed from the fence rail, why he didn't have a name yet. "He's not finished deciding," she said. "That's about right," Silas said. "So you have to wait until he decides," she said, "and then you'll know." "That's what I figured." Lucy watched the horse move. She was very still in the way she went still when she was thinking hard. "Finn," she said eventually. Silas looked at her. "Finn. Because he's still figuring," she said. "Finn figuring. And then later, just Finn." She looked at Silas. "Does that fit?" He looked at the horse. The horse had stopped moving and was standing near the far fence with his head at an angle that suggested he was listening to something only he could hear. "Yeah," Silas said. "I think that fits." Lucy nodded, satisfied. She turned back to August and spent the next 20 minutes explaining the horse about Spring, which August received with enormous dignity. Evelyn stood at the fence beside Silas and watched her daughter, and felt something that was not a complicated feeling for once. It was just warmth, just the straightforward warmth of a life that had room in it now for something other than survival. "She named your horse," Evelyn said. "She did," Silas said. "You're going to be completely outmaneuvered for the next 40 years, she said. "I know," he said. He did not sound troubled by this. They were married on a Saturday in May, which was the only day of the week that could accommodate it without interfering with the school schedule, which Evelyn had been firm about because she was not going to disrupt 19, now 21, children's education for personal reasons. And Silas had said that was fine and meant it. It was not a large wedding. It was not a small one either, because Millhaven had decided to have an opinion about it, and the opinion was favorable, which meant people came without being asked. Martha Greaves brought cake. The Aldrich parents came with the twins. Werner Scholl rode 6 miles with Petra and stood in the back with his hat in his hands and the expression of a man attending something that was making him think about his own life. Danny Greaves was there, cleaned up, his hair pressed flat in a way that suggested his mother had been involved. He sat next to Marcus Callahan, which was a thing that would not have been conceivable in October, and was now apparently ordinary. Roy Callahan was not there. He was in Cheyenne by then, or on the road to it. His house was already sold. The feed store had a new sign over it, a family named Garrett, who had come down from Montana and who had, as of their first week, been in the schoolhouse checking on enrollment for their 3 children. The Garretts did not know about Roy's campaign against the schoolteacher. They simply knew there was a good school and they wanted their children in it. The schoolyard fence, which Silas had been working on since October in what Evelyn now understood was the world's most patient act of presence, was finished. Straight and solid, every post set right, the wire taut and even. It was, she thought, a fair metaphor for the man, though she would not have said that out loud because it was the kind of observation that would have made him uncomfortable and possibly require him to go check something in a barn. She had written to her sister in Ohio, the full account of everything. Her sister, who was a practical woman and had been worried about Evelyn in the specific helpless way of someone who loves a person they cannot reach, had written back 4 pages. The relevant part was near the end. "I can tell from the way you're not saying it that you're happy." That's all I needed to know. She was. She was happy, with the particular quality of happiness that came from the other side of a hard thing. Not uncomplicated happiness, not the happiness of a person who had never lost anything, but the happiness of a person who had lost something real and found that the world had more in it than the loss. It was a different flavor than the happiness she'd had with Thomas, and she had stopped needing it to be the same flavor. It was its own thing. Hers and Silas's and Lucy's, seasoned by everything that had happened to each of them before they arrived at this particular May Saturday in a Wyoming Territory town with mud on the boots of most of the attendees. After the ceremony, which was brief and civil and conducted by the justice of the peace, a man named Harlan, who was 90% deaf but had the essential parts memorized, there was an hour of people milling around the schoolyard with cake and coffee, the way communities marked things when they had collectively decided something was worth marking. Mrs. Prentice found Evelyn near the schoolhouse door. She looked at her with the expression she'd worn since the beginning, which was assessing and reserved, and underneath it, something that had always been there, but had taken 7 months to surface fully. "You've done good work here," she said, not as a compliment, as a statement of record. "Thank you," Evelyn said. "The school was a liability when you came," Mrs. Prentice said. "Now it's an asset. Families are citing it when they're deciding whether to stay or go." She paused. "That's yours." Not the building. The thing you made it. Evelyn looked at the schoolhouse, at the fixed window, at the stovepipe that drew correctly, at the schoolyard fence, straight and solid, enclosing the space where Lucy had gone still in October because a man had laughed at her for not having a father, and the world had felt suddenly and completely hostile. That girl was now across the yard holding a piece of Martha's cake and explaining something to Marcus Callahan that he was clearly paying serious attention to, because Lucy had become the kind of person in the school that other children listened to. Not because she was the loudest or the most socially aggressive, but because she was consistently right and consistently fair, and because she had a quality that was either taught or simply native, and Evelyn had never been entirely sure which was the quality of taking people seriously. It was the right thing to come here, Evelyn said. It was, Mrs. Prentice agreed. She said nothing further, which was its own form of eloquence. Silas found her after Mrs. Prentice moved on. He had cake on his shirt, which had Lucy's fingerprints all over the causality, and he stood beside her at the schoolhouse door and they looked out at the yard together. Thinking? He said. Always, she said. Anything specific? She watched Lucy cross the yard with her characteristic directness, angling toward the fence because August and Finn were in the far pasture visible over the fence line, and she had apparently decided they should know about the cake. I was thinking about October, she said, when we came. What it looked like then. Different, he said. Everything was so hard. The town felt hard. The weather felt hard. I felt hard. She paused. I kept thinking about what Lucy needed, whether I'd made the right choice bringing her here, whether I'd put her somewhere that was going to damage her instead of help her. And now? He said. She looked at her daughter standing at the fence, holding up a piece of cake toward two horses who were too far away to receive it, but appreciated the sentiment. She looked at Martha Greaves organizing plates with the comfortable authority of a woman in her proper element. At Danny Greaves, talking to Werner Scholl about something that had Werner nodding with genuine interest. At Marcus Callahan, who had brought a book, an actual book, tucked under his arm at a social event, because he had become the kind of boy who brought books places and was not embarrassed about it. I think she found exactly what she needed, Evelyn said. And so did I. He put his arm around her shoulder. She let him. She had decided some weeks ago to stop cataloging when she let him do things, and what it communicated to witnesses, partly because the 3-year contract was secured and Roy Callahan was in Cheyenne, and mostly because she was tired of withholding small things that cost nothing and gave a great deal. Silas, she said. What was it like, crossing the street that first day, when Roy said what he said? He was quiet for a moment. She felt him think about it. Honestly, he said. Yes. I was angry, he said. First, Roy says something like that, the instinct is just anger. But then I looked at Lucy. He paused. And it wasn't anger anymore. It was something older than anger. Another pause. I'd had a daughter, he said. I knew what a little girl looked like when something hit her that she hadn't been ready for. I knew what that specific stillness was. He was quiet. I just couldn't walk past it. She nodded. She had suspected something close to this, but hadn't asked because some things deserve to arrive in their own time. You have people now, she said. The thing he'd said to Lucy, saying it back to him. He looked at her. Yeah, he said. I do. The afternoon moved into evening, and people drifted home the way they drifted from things in small towns, gradually and with stops, various conversations requiring completion before any departure could be final. The Aldriches were the last to leave, the twins managing a dignified exit that was undermined when the boy walked directly into the fence post he'd been standing beside for 20 minutes. Martha Greaves was second to last, hugging Evelyn at the gate with the full-bodied embrace of a woman who had been waiting since October to do exactly this. You're going to be all right, she said, into Evelyn's shoulder. Said as fact, not comfort. I know, Evelyn said. Same 2 words. She was beginning to understand their full range. Then it was just the 3 of them, and the schoolyard in the evening light, and the horses visible in the far pasture, and the cabin behind the schoolhouse that had been Evelyn's alone since October and was now simply home. Lucy was sitting on the fence rail, the new fence, the solid one, with her legs dangling, looking at the pasture. She had eaten 3 pieces of cake and was experiencing the specific philosophical stillness that came after a large social event and a significant amount of sugar. Silas walked over and stood beside the fence, and she looked down at him with her dark eyes. "It's official now," she said. "It is," he said. "You're my father now," she said. She said it the way she said things she'd been carrying carefully, not as a question, but not quite as a statement either. Something in between, something that wanted confirmation from the universe. Silas looked at her for a long moment. He had the expression he sometimes got when Lucy said something that arrived exactly in the center of something that had no easy perimeter around it. He put his hand on the fence rail beside her, and he said, "I was your people before it was official." Lucy considered this. "Since October?" "Since October," he said. She thought about it. "That's a long time to be something before it's official." "Sometimes a thing is real before the official part catches up," he said. She accepted this with a nod that said she was filing it under useful information about how the world worked. Then she looked out at the pasture. "Finn's watching us," she said. He looked. The younger horse was standing at the fence of the far pasture with his head over the rail, which he did sometimes when the ranch had activity, and he wanted a better view. "He does that," Silas said. "He wants to be part of things," Lucy said. "He just doesn't know how yet." She said it about the horse. Evelyn, standing a few steps back listening to this, heard all the other things it could be about and thought about October again. The 3 of them arriving in their own particular varieties of not knowing how yet, carrying their griefs and their defenses and their complicated histories, and the long winter of figuring it out, one fixed window and one woodpile and one cup of coffee at a time. The story that Millhaven would tell about them in the years that followed varied depending on who was telling it. Some versions centered on the school teacher who'd transformed the school. Some centered on Roy Callahan's departure and what it said about the town's better instincts winning out. Some centered on Silas Boone coming back to life after 3 years of going through the motions of it. Martha Greaves's version, which Evelyn privately considered the most accurate, centered on Lucy, on the 6-year-old girl who had arrived in October in muddy boots and braids and had looked at the hostile frontier town with her father's measuring eyes and decided, with the serene certainty that children sometimes possess about the things that matter most, that this was going to be home. She was right. She usually was. In the years that came after, there were hard ones. That was the truth of it that Evelyn would have told anyone who asked, and she was not a woman who softened things for the sake of a cleaner story. The winter of the following year brought a storm that kept the school closed for 3 weeks and cost 2 ranching families their entire cattle stock. And Silas spent 6 days out in conditions that no one should have been out in helping those families recover what could be recovered, and came home with frostbite on 2 fingers that took a month to fully heal. And Evelyn had spent those 6 days functioning normally and efficiently, and had not slept more than 3 hours on any of them, because the specific terror of loving someone in dangerous country was something you didn't build complete immunity to. You just learned to carry it. There was a year when the school board reconstituted and brought in a new member who had ideas about curriculum that were wrong in ways that required Evelyn to fight for nearly 8 months before the ideas were quietly abandoned. There was a spring when Lucy, at 9, had a long and terrible grief patch about Thomas that seemed to come from nowhere and was in fact coming from everywhere. From the age she'd reached where her understanding of what death meant had deepened past the 6-year-old version, and the loss was therefore larger and more specific than it had been before. And there was nothing to do about it except sit with her in it and let it move through at the pace it needed. Silas sat with her in it. He didn't try to replace Thomas in that conversation or smooth it over or be useful in the practical way that was his first language. He just sat with Lucy when she needed sitting with, sometimes for an hour, sometimes for 10 minutes, and when she asked him if he missed Clara, he said yes, honestly. And when she asked him if it ever stopped hurting, he said it didn't stop, but it changed. And she had looked at him with her dark eyes and said that made sense. And they had sat there together in the particular fellowship of people who have lost something real and know that the other person understands what real means. Evelyn watched this from the doorway on a November evening when the lamp was low and Silas and Lucy were on the floor with their backs against the bed frame, and Lucy had her head against his arm and was asking him questions about Clara, what she'd been like, what she'd liked, what she'd been afraid of. And he was answering all of them, and the room was quiet and the stove was warm, and something about the scene was so complete and so human and so unrepeatable that Evelyn stood in the doorway and let herself feel it without trying to name it or preserve it or do anything at all except be present at the edge of it. Lucy grew. That was what children did. She kept doing it. At 10, she was the most advanced student in the school, and Evelyn had started supplementing her lessons with materials she'd ordered from Cheyenne because the standard readers were no longer sufficient. At 11, she had started helping with the younger students, not because Evelyn had asked her to, but because she had noticed that Petra Scholl was struggling with certain reading concepts and had simply sat down beside her one afternoon and begun explaining them in the patient, lateral way that Silas explained things. Come at it from a different angle, find what the person already understands, and build from there. Evelyn watched her daughter teach and felt the specific dizziness of seeing a person become themselves. Silas gave Lucy a horse on her 10th birthday. Not August. August was old and entitled to his retirement. And not Finn, who was Silas's working horse, and had become over the years the kind of animal that had a specific and non-transferable relationship with one person. He found her a young mare from a rancher north of town, red-brown with a white mark on her forehead shaped like nothing in particular, and he brought her into the yard on Lucy's birthday morning without announcing it, which meant Lucy opened the cabin door at 7 in the morning and found a horse in the yard wearing a rope with a bow on it that had clearly been tied by someone who had looked up how to tie a bow specifically for this occasion. Lucy stood in the doorway in her nightdress for a full 10 seconds. Then she turned back into the cabin and said, with immense composure, "There's a horse in the yard with a bow on it." "I know," Silas said from the table, drinking his coffee. "That's my horse," she said. "It is." "You got me a horse. Seemed like time." Lucy went back to the doorway and looked at the horse for another 10 seconds. Then she said, "I'm going to name her." "Take your time," he said. She named the horse April, because April was when things that had been waiting started to become real, and because she had been 7 years old on a March morning and had crouched in the cold and looked at the ground and known something was there under the white, just waiting, and had been right. She explained this to Silas in considerable detail while she fed April an apple. He listened to all of it, and then he said, "That's a good reason for a name." "I know," said Lucy. She rubbed April's nose. "She's going to be important," she said. "Yeah," he said. "She is." This was who they were by then. A family that had been built from its specific materials, which were grief and stubbornness, and children who named things carefully, and men who showed up without announcing themselves, and women who asked hard questions before they said yes. Not a family that looked like an illustration of what a family was supposed to look like. A family that functioned, that held, that knew how to sit in the hard parts without trying to skip to the end of them. Evelyn thought about this sometimes, in the quiet, the particular way they had become what they were. She thought about the October morning and the muddy street and Roy Callahan's laugh, which had felt at the time like the first blow of a hostile world announcing its intentions. She thought about how if that laugh hadn't happened, if Roy had been on a different corner or chosen a different morning to perform, Silas might not have crossed the street. The fence might not have been fixed. The first conversation might not have happened. She couldn't fully decide whether it was luck or something else. She settled eventually on calling it the truth about things, that the worst moments sometimes contained inside them the specific friction that struck the specific light. That Roy's cruelty on a cold October morning had been the thing that moved a man who had not moved in 3 years. That Lucy's stillness in the center of a schoolyard had been the thing that reached past all of Silas's careful not letting things matter. The hard thing had been the door. Walking through it had been the choice. She talked about this once with Martha Greaves on a summer evening years later when they were sitting on Martha's porch, and the evening was warm, and the town below them was the town they both knew well enough now to love, in the specific way you loved things you understood completely, with clarity rather than idealization, with the particular affection of people who knew all the flaws and had decided the thing was worth caring for anyway. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if Roy had gone inside that morning?" Evelyn said. "If he'd just kept his mouth shut? Martha thought about it genuinely. Silas would have found a reason, she said. He just would have needed more time. Maybe, Evelyn said. Or maybe he would have stayed careful forever. Maybe, Martha said, but I think… She paused. I think people who are ready to stop being careful usually find the thing that stops them. Roy just happened to be the thing. She looked at the evening. He probably hates that. Evelyn laughed. It was the full laugh, the one that had surprised her the first time it came out in the cabin in October, and that had stopped surprising her eventually and was now just hers. Just the sound she made when something was genuinely funny, which was one of the things she had gotten back that she hadn't known she would. The last image she returned to, in the accounting of how things had gone, was not the wedding in May, or the October morning, or even the April conversation at the table. It was something smaller. A Thursday evening in the following winter, the second winter, when the snow was coming down hard and the school had been closed since noon, and the three of them were in the cabin. Not the original cabin, they had moved to the ranch by then, into the house that Silas had been rattling around alone in for 3 years, and that had been too large for one person and was now, with some difficulty, exactly the right size for 3. Silas was at the table working on something with his hands, some piece of tack that needed repair. Lucy was on the floor with a book, on her stomach with her feet in the air, reading with the complete absorption she brought to books that had gotten hold of her. Evelyn was at the stove, and the snow was at the windows, and the lamp was throwing its circle of warm light across all 3 of them. She had stopped for a moment, just to look, not to catalog or record or feel the weight of what it had cost to get here, just to look at the man working at the table and the child on the floor with her feet in the air and the snow at the windows making everything outside the lamp's reach soft and white and impossibly quiet. This was what she had come to Wyoming for. Not this specifically. She hadn't known to ask for this specifically. She had come because there was no other door open. She had come because $40 a month and a roof and a child who needed feeding had made the decision for her before she could make it herself. And the territory had given her this. The hard winter and the mud and Roy Callahan's laugh, and a man who crossed a street without hurrying and a fence that took 7 months to finish, and a horse named Finn who had been figuring himself out, and a daughter who crouched in the cold and looked at what was actually there and said, "It's coming. It's just waiting. It's right under the white part." She turned back to the stove. The lamp held its light. Outside, the snow came down on Millhaven, Wyoming, on the school that was full and the fence that was straight and the house that had the right number of people in it, and it was quiet in the way that things were quiet when they had arrived somewhere they intended to stay. Lucy turned a page. Silas's hands moved, steady and sure, over the thing that needed fixing. Evelyn kept her hands warm at the stove and let herself be where she was, completely and without reservation, in the only life she had, which was this one, which was enough.